Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're putting on our data detective hats to investigate something that is constantly dominating the headlines: crime in the United States. If you look at the news lately, it can be incredibly difficult to separate the actual facts from the narrative. So we're going to bypass the spin completely. We are using one single rigorous source of truth for our investigation today, and that's the Bureau of Justice Statistics 2022 Criminal Victimization Report. This is a massive, incredibly detailed self-report survey. It captures not just what the police know, but what Americans are literally experiencing on the ground. Okay, let's dive into this and map out our investigation. First, we'll look at the 2022 crime spike, then we'll get a 30-year perspective, followed by property and auto thefts, the demographics of crime, and finally, the reporting gap.
All right, Section 1, the 2022 crime spike.
So, in 2022, there was a pretty significant shift. The rate of violent victimization in the U.S. rose to 23.5 victimizations per 1,000 people aged 12 or older. And just for context, this category includes things like rape or sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and simple assault. Now, what makes this 23.5 figure so notable is actually what it's being compared to. Because during the height of the pandemic, right around 2020 and 2021, the U.S. actually saw 30-year lows in this specific metric. It hovered right around 16.4 to 16.5 per 1,000. So when we look purely at the year-over-year data from 2021 to 2022, there is an undeniable statistically significant jump in violent crime. It's right there in the numbers.
Moving to Section 2, the 30-year perspective. Let's zoom out a bit.
To avoid falling into recency bias, context is absolutely everything. Take a look at this data straight from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and this brilliantly illustrates what I'm talking about. See the top line? That shows total violent victimization, while the line right below it shows what was actually reported to the police. If you look at the far right side, you can clearly see that upward hook, which is the 2021 to 2022 increase we literally just talked about. But look at where it sits compared to the left side of the chart. That recent uptick is completely dwarfed by the massive reassuring downward slope of crime over the last 3 decades. To put that visual into stark, concrete numbers for a second, in 1993, the violent victimization rate was a staggering 79.8 incidents per 1,000 people. By 2022, even with that recent spike we just saw included, the rate was down to 23.5. Think about that. So despite these short-term increases that inevitably grab today's headlines, the overarching reality is that the overall violent victimization rate has actually declined by over 70% since 1993. We are quite literally living in a drastically safer society than we were 30 years ago.
Okay, Section 3, property and auto thefts.
Shifting gears a bit, in 2022, U.S. households experienced a massive 13.4 million property victimizations. This is a super broad category. It covers everything from minor theft all the way up to serious burglary. Interestingly, though, the trends here are kind of mixed. The rate of burglary and trespassing was actually lower in 2022 than it was in 2018. It sat at 14.6 per 1,000 households, and honestly, it's remained relatively flat since 2020. However, there is a clear outlier here, and that's motor vehicle theft. This specific crime saw a very noticeable jump from 4.3 per 1,000 in 2021 all the way up to 5.5 in 2022. Let's move to Section 4, the demographics of crime, and see how this builds our understanding. Now, what's really interesting about this information is the stark contrast between who actually makes up our general population versus who is committing these offenses, at least based on victims' perceptions. Males make up about 49% of the U.S. population, right? Yet, they were the offenders in nearly 79% of violent incidents in 2022. Conversely, females make up 51% of the population, but they were the offenders in only about 17% of these incidents. It's a dramatic imbalance, for sure. And it really highlights just how heavily skewed violent crime is toward male offenders. In geography, well, geography plays a massive role in this puzzle too. From 2021 to 2022, the data shows that violent crime actually increased across all geographic areas. It wasn't just isolated to one specific environment. However, the rates themselves are far from equal. Urban residents experience the highest rate by a really wide margin, sitting at 33.4 victimizations per 1,000 persons. That drops to 23.9 in suburban areas, and then falls even further to 15.4 in rural areas. So there's this clear, undeniable gradient happening. The more densely populated the area, the higher your statistical likelihood of experiencing violent victimization. But how much of this crime does law enforcement actually know about? Let's get into Section 5, the reporting gap.
Visualizing this unknown space is absolutely crucial for anyone who is trying to understand true crime rates. Get this. In 2022, only 42% of violent victimizations were actually reported to the police. That means a staggering 58%, that's nearly 3 out of every 5 violent victimizations, went completely unreported. Now, victims choose not to report for a whole variety of reasons, right? Fear of reprisal, a belief that police can't or maybe won't help, or just feeling the issue is too personal or trivial. But from a data perspective, it means that if you're only looking at police reports, you are literally missing more than half of the entire picture. This underlying reporting data also reveals a shift in the severity of these incidents. Looking at the totality of these victimizations, so both the reported and unreported ones, we found that roughly 10% of all violent victimizations in 2022 involved a firearm. That means the offender either possessed, showed, or actually used a gun. So the crucial point is, this is a statistically significant increase from 7% just the previous year in 2021. Well, we have covered a lot of ground today. We've seen that while violent crimes certainly ticked up in 2022, it still remains a fraction of what it was back in the early 1990s. We've seen shifts in property crime, some pretty stark demographic realities, and a massive, massive gap in what actually gets reported to the police. So I want to leave you with a question to think about. Knowing that the 2022 uptick exists within a massive 30-year decline, does this objective data change how you view today's crime headlines? I highly encourage you to go explore the Bureau of Justice Statistics data for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the right questions.